Okay, hello everyone. Without a further ado, let's start reading. Living Christ. In other ways, too, preserving the human aspect of Christ prevented the divine withdrawing to an alien, unimaginable supernatural realm. If Christ was a human being, if Christ was the human Jesus, he was born in a specific time and place and was a Jew. Even Leo, who so despised Jews and Judaism, stressed that Jesus was absolutely rooted in his Hebrew ancestry and in the world of the, the Old Testament. The genealogies quoted in the Gospels, those long lists of begats that sent modern readers to sleep, decisively proclaim Christ's human status. Chalcedon wrecks any attempts to de-Judaize Jesus. Each side likewise offered a different way of reading the Bible. Alexandrians worked from a Greek philosophical tradition and used the scriptural text to illustrate their conclusions. Every word and line of the Bible became an allegory bearing a spiritual truth which might or might not have any connection with actual historical events in the first century Palestine. Yes, the Alexandrians and the line of Alexandrians is actually as well as the origin. He's also his teacher and his disciple, August, August from Hippona. And the Augustinian doctrine and what the Augustine teach is what actually every Protestant believes. That's the core beliefs of the Protestant, the Augustinianism. So, in that way, according to this book, every Protestant is more close to the Alexandrians than to the Antiochians because of the Augustine and Origin and sorry, it was the other way around. The disciple of Origin uh, was someone else, and it was the Augustine was a disciple of a disciple of an Origin, and the teacher of an Origin was Neoplatonic. August. Sacus or something like that. If I would remember it totally, but he was Neoplatonic, and this tradition of Neoplatonism that goes from the teacher of Origin that was openly Neoplatonic, and the Origin was covertly Neoplatonic, and Augustine and the Ambrose, yes, the Ambrose was a disciple of the Origin, and the Ambrose teach Augustine. So that's the line of succession from Neoplatonics to Augustinian to modern Protestants from the Luther, because Luther was a very he thought that what Augustine wrote was very important and was basically truth. So, and Augustine was saying that Neoplatonism was the same teachings as what he read from Christianity. So that's very important to know that aspects of those Alexandrian traditions, because that Bible is an allegory. Uh, that statement comes from the origin, and he wrote about that. And it doesn't have to have any connection with actual historical events in first century Palestine. That the when the author is speaking about the Alexandrians, he is talking about the origin that was born in the Alexandria. I guess that's what he is referring to. Nestorius, in contrast, had his root in Antioch, which read the scriptural text in terms of historical events to be expounded and commented upon. When you read the Gospels in that way, it is hard to avoid the idea of a human Christ, the man who wept. The definitions of Chalcedon reasserted the real rather than symbolic nature of biblical truth. Just as central to the story is the struggle to preserve the feminine face of the divine. Driving much of the 5th century controversy was the astounding rise of the cult of the Virgin Mary, the boast that she was literally the Mother of God. Pagans mocked these claims to create a new goddess, but many Christians too were offended. Some thought that the concept of Mother of God was absurd, as Nestorius asks shockingly, was God really present in the world as a 2-month-old infant? While others rejected any attempts to undercut the deity of Christ at any stage of his earthly life. On this point, at least, one nature believers agreed wholeheartedly with the Orthodox Catholic Church, and Marian devotion flourished. Well, they still do, actually. Egyptians especially had a potent devotion to the Mother of God, who is the subject of a magnificent tradition in early art. The Coptic Monophysite Church has had a long love affair with Mary. Wonderful. Stretching the human Jesus also permitted the development and growth of Christian visual art and thereby of much of Western culture. We easily forget just what an extraordinary phenomenon this visual tradition was. Monotheistic religions are often deeply suspicious of visual arts, whether of sacred figures or the human forms as such. Partly this reflects a fear of idolatry, but it also shows reluctance even to accept to reproduce holy forms. Although that restraint is not universal, at various times in history, both devout Muslims and Jews happily painted human beings. It is widespread. Christianity could certainly have followed a similar path, and various movements through centuries have practiced iconoclasm, the smashing of images. Yet Christian visual arts survived, with the overwhelmingly rich depiction of Christ's humanity. All the image of child was his mother, of the child with his mother, or the teacher and the crucified victim, losing half the world. The way these concepts are remembered tells us a great deal about how Christian history is written and, by extension, the history of other great causes or movements. We often hear the complaint that winners write history. Well, yes, they do. But the situation is in fact worse than that. Yeah. In practice, historians write retroactively from a point of view of those who would win at some later point. Even if that victory was nowhere in sight at the time that they are describing. That is certainly what happens when we identify Chalcedon as a final triumph of orthodoxy. Accounts of early Christianity make the year 451 a decisive break, a vital transition from the ancient origin of the faith to its medieval millennium. But such an account ignores the century so after Chalcedon, when that particular school of thought might easily have been reversed. Between 451 and 540s, Chalcedonians and their movement and their enemies rose and fell in their power at the Roman court. And there were periods of several decades when Monophysites controlled not just the empire, but most of the main bishoprics and patriarchates. Focusing on 451 misses the long centuries after Chalcedon had secured recognition as empire official creed, but when in many lands in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, Chalcedonians were at best a suspect minority. Debates over the nature of Christ was still vividly active in 650 or 800. And in much of the world, those battles ended in crushing victory for Chalcedon's foes. The result wasn't even close. Despite the theologian slogans of that time, Christ was not divided, but the Christian world certainly was, irreparably. Well, actually, if anyone will say to you that Christian always believed what they believed, well, here we go. They never were believing the same things. Never. Now, Christian division as such were not new, at least since Apostle left Jerusalem. At no point in Christian history has one single church plausibly claimed the loyalty of all believers to the exclusion of rival institutions. So there goes the apostolic succession, and that there was something as a church, and the unity of church, and that the church always believed the same things. I'm sorry to say to you, but that's just not true, to say it mildly. In the mid 4th century, perhaps half of all Christians belonged to some group that the great church, Catholic Church, I guess, regarded as heretical or schismatic, and new splits continued to form. Viewed, viewed historically, a denominationally divided world is not an exceptional circumstances for Christians, but the conventional norm. Dilemmas of interchurch conflicts and cooperation go back literally to the foundation of the faith. But post Chalcedonian splits were on an unprecedented scale. Why? Because Chalcedon is so shockingly not true that it's hard to agree with this. Okay? It needs to be very much guarded and uh, how to say it, imposed politically to make it seemed like, well, it for a starter, it need not to be talked about. Okay, so that's where when I am talking about it, it's wrong. Most of the history, you need to have authorization of the Pope to even be able to talk about it. Otherwise, all of your writings, including possibly yourself, could end up in a burning stake. Okay, so that was the danger. I don't have a permission of the Pope to talk about it, and actually, who cares? But post Chalcedonian splits were on an unprecedented scale. Sustained resistance to official doctrines spawned two vast and enduring movements that the winning party would call heretical, respectively Nestorians and Monophysites, and each has left remnants up to the present day. In terms of historical tradition and continuity, those churches have a far better claim to a connection with the ancient sources of the faith in terms of geography, culture, and language, not to mention ethnicity, Then do the upstart community's headquarters in Rome and Constantinople. Exactly. Apostolic traditions. Yeah. Well, Paul was in Rome shortly, but Peter was never in Rome. With a century or so after Chalcedon, the Christian world fragmented into several great transcontinental divisions: Orthodox, Catholics, Monophysites, Nestorians, and Arians. Although each church agreed fully with its neighbors in essentials, each declared itself to be the one and only true church and did not acknowledge the credentials of other bodies or share communion with them. Already by 550, Christendom was quite as divided as it would be during the great early modern split between Catholic, Protestants, and Orthodox. Well, it was always divided, but for some time it was pretended that it wasn't. Okay. If you agreed with the Pope, agreed that you don't want to think about the Trinity, and you don't want to talk about the Trinity, you are fine. So just agreeing with the Pope and not talk about the Trinity. Because if you talked about it, the chances were your kind of Trinity is not the right one. So just people just pretended and never talked about it. And if you were like had a political reforms like saying that you should be living like Christ, you were close on the out. Well, that depends. That depends if you go as far as to say something bad about the Pope, okay? So you were like, you're not going against the Pope, but if you were saying that you should live like Jesus, you should then be wary what you're saying about the Pope. That was the only conditions, okay? There were so many heresies at that time, and so many divisions, but people just generally didn't thought about it, didn't wasn't thinking about this. They weren't talking about this, and they weren't preaching about this. So that was fine. Well, if you were preaching about this, well, you were ending quite badly. That's what it was. So yeah, it was always like that. Just the only reason was it open or was it covert? Yeah. So that's for today. Thanks for watching. God bless.